The double standard here has been striking and, quite frankly, disappointing. What makes no sense to me is all the abuse by the Department of Justice and the FBI, the unprofessional conduct, the shady behavior. Nobody seems to think that's much important. Well, that's going to change, I hope. To those who were abusive of the process in 2016 on the other side, you haven't had much scrutiny, but that's coming.
So the scrutiny is coming. Joining us now to discuss this is Newsmax contributor and Harvard Law professor emeritus Alan Dershowitz. Professor Dershowitz is also the author of The Case Against Impeaching President Trump. Professor Dershowitz, great to see you. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you. I don't approve of the effort to try to retaliate against bad investigations with more bad investigations. I think we should have mutual disarmament, put the investigations behind us, let the government govern, let the legislature legislate, let the president act presidential. I think enough investigations. So I'm not in favor of continued investigations on either side. Tit for tat, no, that's not the way we should govern.
There does seem to be an appetite for vengeance here coming from some. And, Professor, yesterday, former FBI Director James Comey tweeted a picture of himself in the woods with a caption that read so many questions. And to your point, Senator Lindsey Graham later responded, quote, "Could not agree more. See you soon." He alerted to this earlier. But, we're likely going to see more investigations into the FBI and to Comey. What do you think the end result of those investigations will be?
I think much like the end result of the investigations of President Trump, a lot of noise and very little real impact. The one area where I think investigation may be warranted is whether or not Justice Department officials misled the FISA court by submitting the dossier without fully alerting them to the sources of the dossier and the lack of credibility of the person who wrote it. And the FISA court might consider having contempt of court proceedings to determine whether or not they were deliberately misled, because misleading a court, particularly a court like the FISA court, is really very dangerous to democracy.
Yeah, there's a lot of mystery, obviously, surrounding the whole institution of the FISA court. President Trump has also hinted that he might declassify some of that information. At this point, since the investigation is finished, the special counsel's investigation, what would prohibit the president from releasing that information?
I don't think so, except usually he'll take the advice of the CIA and the national security agencies to make sure that nothing is declassified. Now, the president has to know, of course, that among the allegations made in the dossier were allegations relating to accusations of sexual carryings on in Russia, probably completely untrue, but they will probably come out if declassification of everything occurs.
I mean, that's what some are calling for. The president even today said that he's not against having the entire report released, but it does look like Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell blocked a resolution that would have called for the full release of the report. I mean, since the FISA and the Steele dossier and a lot of the information that went into the FISA warrant has been deemed sensational and not necessarily credible, how could that hurt President Trump, do you think?
It probably couldn't, except just to read the exact words and see on television detailed descriptions of what was falsely alleged. You just don't want to see those things repeated. But I think on balance, it would be far better to have everything come out. Certainly from the point of view of the American public, it's better to have everything come out so we can evaluate the credibility of those in the Justice Department who did this. Look, I think one of the institutions that really suffered badly from this whole investigation has been the Justice Department. Attorney General Barr is trying very hard to restore the integrity of the department along with that of the FBI. And I think they're doing a decent job of it. But we really need to mend the fences because we saw certainly lots of abuses, FBI agents saying things about the president when they were involved in investigations that would suggest a strong bias. We need to have an FBI and a Justice Department that's non-political and unbiased. I hope we can get there.
And Professor, you would, put your faith and confidence in the Inspector General who's currently looking into these things, as opposed to having another political investigation, something done from one of these dioceses on the Senate committee, for example.
Oh, absolutely. I don't believe in Republican truth versus Democratic truth. I believe in real truth, and I think the Inspector General could do a real good job. He did last time, and he has great credibility, And he's not going to do what Mueller did. He'll do the job. He won't say on the one hand, on the other hand, maybe he should be prosecuted, maybe he shouldn't be prosecuted. That's what law professors and hedge fund operators do. That's not what Mueller should have done.
Yeah.
He should only get half of his salary because he only did half of his job.
Yeah, you haven't pulled any punches with Robert Mueller and the results here. You think he kind of wimped out at the end?
I do. I think he did a good job from everything I've seen. I haven't read the report yet on the Russia investigation, but I can't imagine why a former Marine, a former director of the FBI, a former U.S. attorney wouldn't just take the bull by the horns and say, look, I've listened to the arguments pro, I've listened to the arguments con, I'm the decision maker, here's what I think. That's what he should have done.
And effectively, since there was no proof of collusion or coordination with the Russian government, there couldn't really be any real obstruction. Is that what you read into the summary?
No, I think that's wrong. You can technically obstruct justice, even if you're obstructing it about something that wasn't a crime at all. If you destroy evidence, if you tamper with witnesses, if you bribe witnesses, that's obstruction of justice, even if you do it to avoid being accused of something you didn't do. But it's, as Barr put it, it's an important element. It's very rare that you have a successful obstruction of justice when the underlying crime doesn't exist. So it's a fair point.
All right. So, Professor, let's take a listen to President Trump before and after he flew back to Washington, D.C. yesterday. Let's take a listen.
It was just announced there was no collusion with Russia, the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. It's a shame that our country had to go through this. To be honest, it's a shame that your president has had to go through this before I even got elected. I just want to tell you that America is the greatest place on earth. The greatest place on earth. Thank you very much.
He sounds like a man who feels vindicated.
Well, he was vindicated. Legally, he's been completely vindicated and exonerated. The only question is obstruction of justice. We have to wait and see what the evidence is. I suspect I know what it is, and it will be bogus in the end. You can't indict a president or charge a president with obstruction for firing somebody. That's within his constitutional authority, or for exercising his power under the unitary executive.
Right.
Those are all of his constitutional authority. So I suspect the distinction will not be factual. It will be whether or not you can charge a president for things that were within his constitutional authority.
And based on the way he handled the whole Hillary Clinton email situation, there's certainly grounds, one could argue, for firing James Comey. All right, Professor, what happens to people like former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn and former Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort, who are hoping to get pardons from the president? The White House says they're not talking about pardons right now. Do you believe that?
I do. I think we have to wait until the report comes out. I don't think there'll be pardons until the report comes out. My three recommendations to the president were don't tweet, don't testify, don't pardon. He followed the don't testify part of it. He should pardon lots of people, but not people who are directly involved, at least not now. I think the likelihood of pardons increases if the Mueller report really is more exonerating than it is condemning. I don't think he's going to pardon Manafort. Whether or not Stone and Flynn, those are different stories. We have to wait to see what the evidence is against Stone. But, you know, Manafort's crimes were, some of them at least, unrelated to anything with the president. And I don't see pardon, perhaps a commutation, a shortening of the sentence down the line. But if I were Manafort, I wouldn't be counting on it.
He's going to go to prison for a long time. Professor, with the Mueller report, now that it's officially wrapped up, it's not the end of the investigation into the president or his inner circle. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York is still working on multiple probes, also state prosecutors in New York as well. But according to an article in The Hill, they were speaking to legal experts, and they say, quote, the SDNY could pose an even greater threat to the president, his family, and his businesses. Do you agree with that assessment? And what do you think the legal peril is that remains based on the Southern District of New York? Still a federal investigation, still under the Attorney General, but a slightly different set of circumstances.
I've always said from day one that his greatest concern was not the Mueller Commission, but the Southern District of New York, because they can look into things for which he has no constitutional defense, business practices prior to becoming a candidate, prior to becoming president. I don't know what's there, but if you search hard enough, any business, you're going to find something. And so if they're really looking for something, I think there is some cause for concern. I do think the fact that he was exonerated from the Mueller investigation, at least most of the way, is going to dampen the enthusiasm of the Southern District. We're going to see opportunistic state officials trying to make their name by going after him because he can't pardon people who are charged for state offenses. But I think mostly his vulnerability has been substantially diminished. And I think for the president, it was a good day. I don't think it's quite a victory lap day, but it was a good day.
The BBC, I think, called it the president's best day since he's been in office yesterday with that report. Hard to argue against that, at least having that.
Well, I think he's had some very good days. I think today was a very good day. I think recognizing the sovereignty of Israel over the Golan Heights was a terrific step forward, the right thing to do. I have to acknowledge I spoke to the president about that. I urged him to do it. I said that you don't give back a battleship captured in a defensive war, and the Golan Heights is a battleship. So I think he did a terrific job today with Prime Minister Netanyahu.
A big day for that, for sure.
Do great work. Look, I voted for Hillary Clinton, but I always want to see our president succeed. When I'm on an airplane, I root for the pilot, and he's the pilot.
He is the pilot of our country right now. It's a good analogy. Last topic before we let you go, I'd love to have you back to talk about the whole Israel situation. It's critically important, but we have to ask you about Michael Avenatti, the adult film star lawyer who represented Stormy Daniels, his former attorney, back in the news today. Federal prosecutors in New York announced today that they will charge Avenatti with extortion. He attempted to extort $20 million from the shoemaker Nike. He's also being charged with bank and wire fraud by prosecutors in California. What's your take on this? Avenatti apparently caught on a wire trying to extort Nike for $20 million.
Well, I never feel good about any lawyer or anybody being prosecuted, and we do have a presumption of innocence. But, Avenatti really asked for it. He has a big mouth, and I think he allowed his big mouth to take over his legal ethics if the facts and the allegations are true with the Nike. The other allegations are much more serious. For Nike, you have a defense, maybe. It was a negotiation. He was trying to make a deal. The tapes don't make that look very good. But if the allegations about keeping a client's money and writing a fake settlement and not paying taxes for 2 years, those seem very, very incriminating. But presumption of innocence must prevail. Remember, it was CNN he was the go-to guy. They went to him all the time. And they banned me because they didn't like the fact that I was calling it down the middle and not allowing partisan considerations to enter into my analysis. They didn't want me on their show, but they certainly wanted Avenatti.
And Mark Geragos, too, who's also been named as a co-conspirator.
Well, Mark Geragos is a good lawyer, but these last 2 days have not been good days for CNN.